welcome to everybody to the Stade Salon Urbain. Before we start with the presentation and with the lecture, I would like to give the word to Busy, who will tell us a few words about exactly about the events, other events and other activities that she's busy with. He's busy with, sorry.
Thank you. Okay, clearly it's the first time I'm on the stage. Normally I'm working in the offices. So I just wanted to say a few words about the Beursgouwbuurt, where you're sitting right now, and about the programmation we are having. My name is Bissy. I work here as audience responsible. And we're currently organizing this weekend. It started yesterday and it will last until tomorrow. A series of events that are called Architectures of Violence. And I think maybe it might be interesting to some of you. So there's an exposition that is happening one floor above us. There's also a screening that is looped, 40 minutes of film that you can find downstairs, not there. There are the toilets. You go out and then you go down. And it's a short film on the uprisings that happened in Forêt in the 90s. So it's about police violence, gentrification, racism. And then there's also a performance tonight at 9 o'clock. No, it starts at 8:30. It's free, you don't need to register, you just have to show up on time, more or less, at the reception. And it's a performance by two artists who work with words, poetry, performance. So if you're interested in that, you're also welcome. And then there are other events. Tomorrow also a workshop, and tomorrow here at 7, there's a sound performance by a black artist who worked with poetry, live podcast thing. So I look very forward to that. I will leave some flyers at the bar, but if you want any more information, you can ask at the reception or anyone who looks like working here. Voila. So enjoy the conference with Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So again, welcome to the Stade Salon Urbain. As you most of you might know, this is like a series of lectures that takes place every year, always about urban themes. And this year, the theme of this year is just transition. So everything that is related to the urban environment and related and environmental justice and so far and so further. This evening we'll speak about citizen science with Muki Haklay, and I'm sure that most of you might know what is citizen science, and if not, you'll discover very quickly. And I think it's interesting because citizen science is not per se only an urban theme, but I think it is an important theme when we speak about urban transition. And so our speaker today Muki Haklay, Professor Muki Haklay, has long experience in the team. He's a professor in geographic information science at the University College London and team leader in the Learning Planet Institute in Paris. And then, among other things, he's the co-director of the Extreme Citizen Science Group at UCL and the co-founder of Mapping for Change, a social enterprise dedicated to community mapping and citizen science. With more than 20 years of experience in participatory science, both using citizen science as a method and also to reflecting about citizen science, about its potential and its limits, is definitely like the good person to explain to us citizen science. On a recent exchange, actually on social media, he said he would be discussing links between community and citizen science, the benefit and risk of artificial intelligence, and the role of citizen sensing. And so I look very much forward to listening to you. Welcome to the floor.
With this. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. It's an opportunity to cover different aspects of citizen science and community science, kind of think about the aspects of those two things and how they relate to each other. And what I'm going to do this evening, first of all, I'm going to talk with you about setting the scene, kind of. So we have a common vocabulary, and each of us has different idea of citizen science. So you put even expert in citizen science in the same room, and actually, like the blind people and the elephant, each one of them will have a slightly different concept of what citizen science is. So let's talk, first of all, what it is. Then we'll kind of ask the question, so who is participating and where and what they are doing? And we'll see a little bit of the research that tell us some information about that. And then we'll kind of put that aside. And I'll jump into something that directly relate to just transition and aspects of cities, which is about environmental information. And I'll kind of talk about the role of environmental information in environmental decision making, and I'll talk about it from the perspective of the public, so we have some idea about why we have public participation in public access to environmental information within the framework of environmental decision making, and we'll see some problem in this area. And then with this knowledge, so now we have the citizen science and we have the understanding of environmental information, we'll look at specific issue of citizen and community science in sustainable cities. And finally, we kind of looked at some of the insight, what we learned from all these things, what kind of questions we can ask about it. So, as promised, we'll start with what is citizen science. And here are two visions of citizen science. The first of them come from a brochure that was just produced for Horizon Europe, the big funding program of the European Union, which will go on for at least 5 years plus. And it's talking about citizen science as voluntary participation of non-professional scientists in research and innovation at different stages of the process and at different level of engagement, from shaping research agenda and policies to gathering, processing, and analyzing data. So notice that it's a very expansive definition of what citizen science is. Compare that to an earlier definition, which you can find in the Oxford English Dictionary, where citizen science is a scientific work undertaken by members of the general public, often in collaboration or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. The experts in Oxford English Dictionary were correct to notice that when you look at examples of citizen science and this type of public participation in research, in most cases it's actually happening in scientific institutions and under the control of scientists. But there is a lot of work that actually the word often and the word or are doing in this definition. So they kind of thought about each of them, but they are doing a lot of work there. So let's look why they are doing a lot of work. So here's a framework. It's not a good typology. I created it, and it's not a good one. The reason that it's not a good one, it's created in order to introduce people to citizen science, and on that bit, it is good. But as a general typology, I'll show you another one later on. So what we're going to talk about is kind of three aspects, different areas. So we talk about long-running citizen science, so areas where the public has participated in scientific activity for a long time. We'll talk about citizen cyber science, which is type of participation that wouldn't be possible without computers and the internet. So the term was invented by Francois Gray from CERN around 2009. And finally, I'll talk with you about community science, which is a subset of the whole framework. And the point about all these terminologies that you see below, which I'll also introduce to you, is to basically tell you that there is a lot of terms floating around this area, loads of them. And what happened is that citizen science became an umbrella term that captures all these type of different activities that happen before it and around it and other things. And some people don't like to call their activities citizen science, and that's fine. But if they want to get, say, funding from the European Union, they better call it citizen science. And that's one of the reasons why it's important, actually, to have an expansive definition. Because if you go after narrow definition, say the Oxford English Dictionary, some practices, say, in the humanities, will find themselves out in the cold and without funding. So remember, the terminology is kind of something that academics talk a lot about, but it does have implication in the real world. So let's start with our long-running citizen science. That's a classic long-running citizen science. Bird ringing, you know, that stuff. is example from Belgium. It's been running since 1927. Carol recognized it from the work in the museum. And actually, that's an example of citizen science done by expert citizen scientists. You can't just walk out and become a bird ringer. You need to have training, you need to pass exams, you need to do all this work, and you're doing extremely important work in ability to monitor biodiversity and change in bird population. But you also have activities that are across a lot of areas. People are also observing butterfly and moths and insects and a lot of other things. And you can have activities that are kind of designed, say, around education. So in the UK, every end of January, the last week of January, there is something called the Big Garden Bird Watch that is organized by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And what it requires is, say, take the children, look out of the window, because, hey, it's January, it can be cold, and look which birds you can see in the garden, and report them back. And this program has been running since the 70s. And with the new technology, it's becoming better. So notice, for example, how you can use an app to pick up the birds that are the most likely be in the area where you're talking. You can have also a timer, so we are more confident that people are doing it for the hour that they expected. And then, even if we're talking about children, they can still use the pictures to identify the information correctly and well enough. In 2021, million people participate in that, making it the biggest citizen science anywhere in the world. Another very exciting project that is directed to education is running by the Natural History Museum here, and it's Xperi Lab, which kind of supported by different bodies, and it's running, it's visited a lot of schools all over Belgium, and the most important things about this experience, it can get into very marginalized community or areas that otherwise science museum and science activity won't get there, and it kind of educates the children to become part of the citizen science activity in their area and kind of creating all sorts of interesting aspects. So that's one type of observation with a special attention to bird. Another area where you have a lot of activity is meteorology. People have been participating in sharing meteorological or climatological observation for over 150 years. But now we have extreme weather event because of climate change. And places like Austria created a trusted network. And the reason that you need a trusted network of observers is that for extreme weather event, it's really important to know, say, at the top of a mountain, if there's starting to be a lot of rain, for the people at the bottom of the mountain to be ready for a flood. And that requires you to have a very distributed network of observers that you can trust, that will report and trigger the early warning system. So that's an example of recruiting people, again, ensuring that they are very reliable and trusted and can involve in things. Another one from an area that's been going on for a long time, archaeology. Again, people were participating in digging and in other activities for a long time, and there was a lot of people with interest. But the problem here that citizen science solves is that there are a lot of monuments across the whole country, across the whole territory. And some of them are important and being protected by national bodies, but a lot of them will be local. And we need to kind of know what's going on with them. And people are visiting them while walking the dog or doing other things. And therefore, you can ask them to start sharing information about it and build up a record and build local interest and other aspects. So Monument Monitor is an example of that, and there are other examples of that. So what you're seeing here in all these examples is kind of traditional things that sometimes have a very long history, but are using modern technologies and kind of adapting to them. Let's move into the area of citizen cyberscience, which, as I said, wouldn't be possible without the internet. So the first one is volunteer computing. You download software on your computer, and when you are not using it, which is actually most of the time, because between the moment you type A and B on your computer, you've been, gave the CPU nothing to do for a period of time. So that computing power can be used by scientists to address problems like climate change in terms of running models that they wouldn't get into resources of computing otherwise. So even though climate scientists have access to supercomputers, they don't have ability to run crazy models, which is the climate prediction net allow them to run and actually test how representative are the official models compared to others, and even attribution of saying how much a specific extreme weather event is related is to climate change was possible because of 60,000 people that donate their spare computing cycle for it. And now it's even possible to do it on your smartphone. So you can contribute to science while you're asleep, which is not a bad thing to do. So when your smartphone is completely charged, it starts to do processing work in help of scientists, and that's a project that's done by Vodafone. The next type of kind of online interaction is volunteer thinking, is when people are contributing their cognitive ability into a process. So that's one of the early projects, which is called Zooniverse, and there is a very nice story about Hanny von Erkel. So she is a teaching assistant from the Netherlands, and she is following the group Queen, and she liked them. Now, in the group Queen, there was the guitarist called Brian May, and anyone know what Brian May has done before he joined Queen? He was doing a PhD in astrophysics, and he just dumped it in order to be the guitarist of Queen. So and after, by the way, he's now Dr. Brian May, because he came back and he finished his PhD in Imperial College, and you can see a picture of him. So Hanny liked him and followed him. And one day he was saying to people, you can join in on Galaxy Zoo and classify images of galaxies in order to help scientists map different galaxies. And then Hanny got hooked to it, and then one time she suddenly saw this green frog in one of the pictures. And instead of just passing it and going on, she started to ask, what's that? And she continued to ask on the forum and didn't leave it. And now this object is called After Air. So it's called now Hanny's object, and she got a paper with her name on it. And a project from here is also a fascinating project that is in Leuven. And that one is sonify different stars and can allow people to participate in classifying and understanding different types of stars and their life cycle through this sonification. And another type, if we're talking about the combination with artificial intelligence, think about how much, if you go into the literature on scientific models that are using artificial intelligence or machine learning, which we should call it, because it's pattern matching, you'll discover that this data set that they are feeding the machine are actually fairly small. And the reason for that is that scientists don't have all the time in the world to kind of classify 100,000 images. They cannot do that. Try to do it yourself, and you'll get bored, or you'll start performing really badly after a period of time. Actually, the story of Galaxy Zoo is that they needed 1 million images, and the PhD students who were starting it, Kevin Shawinski, got completely out of his head by finishing 50,000 images, which is the reason why they gave the public access to the information. So you need to have something like that, and the JASA Institute in Austria was creating things like, for example, for classifying informal settlements, you have a lot of images, and you need to say how many floors there are to the houses, and that can, for example, be used for different humanitarian practices. And because now with volunteers we can get many thousands of images classified and fairly quickly, we can actually start using it for better AI model. And another example of volunteer thinking that exists from here is the, and I won't try to pronounce that, you'll pronounce it, because I'll really make a mess of it. It's not because I can't, I'll just make a mess of it, and it's not fair on the language. So that's an example of people putting in sensors in their gardens, and again, a really great example of what citizen science is capable to do. So as Karen Cooper from North Carolina State University is saying, one of the most inaccessible places to science is people's back garden. And that sounds counterintuitive, but actually, if you've been working in the area of participatory research, you know that in order to get to someone's back garden, you will need to kind of coordinate with them, find time when they're free, find time when you're free, then get to them. Try to do it times 1,000 homes, and you completely run out of your time for your project. However, if you actually ask them to get a sensor, install it in their garden, link it to the Wi-Fi at home, and then join the project, hey presto, you can get even 2 more people. So that's an example of this type of solution that citizen science allow you to do. And the final thing in the examples of citizen cyber science is passive sensing. So we all carry out, quite powerful computers and sensing devices in our pocket, and we can use them for different purposes. So you can use them, for example, for sensing if someone else is in the same area as you, and you can simulate the spread of a pandemic. And actually, as part of a program that was created for the BBC in 2018, a group of scientists created a software, and then they roll it out in a specific city, but also roll it out outside, and that's Dr. Hannah Fry presenting it, and you would put it, and then it would kind of use the simulation of the Bluetooth to notice who was near to whom. At the early stages of the pandemic in the UK, the model that came out of this program was actually used for this purpose. Now notice that after saying that I'm willing to participate in it, I'm putting the software and then I'm not doing anything else to do that, but I am expecting to get feedback from the researchers. So you can contribute to science, as you notice with the examples of kind of from spending huge amount of time of learning how to be a bird ringer, all the way to spending 1 hour with the children looking out of the window, or putting software on your phone and forgetting, or going asleep. So the final type that we kind of need to understand is community science. And in this one, unlike the others, all the other examples that I showed you, the scientists were in control of the research question, and also where the data will collect it. They kind of, for example, they can get a lot of people replying for their call for getting the sensors, but they can decide who they give the sensor to in order to get appropriate distribution. Here in community science, we're giving much more power to community members. So this is an example of people next to London City Airport, and they are concerned about noise. And when they told us that they are concerned about noise, we went and bought for them noise meters, so we're talking about 2008, and a paper map with the location of the airport. So that's London City Airport over here, so they can mark where they see it. And then they have a form to fill in the different observation. Now what you can't read is that in addition to recording the level, and the idea is that they will record 3 observations over a period of time. So people can't say that they just put in the noise meter at the time when a plane passed by, but also there is a whole range of aspects of words that they can use to circle quickly what they think about the noise. So with word like sharp, or word like quiet, or other words that they can actually quickly describe their emotions about it. And a few years later, by 2012, it was possible to provide it as an app. And that's the app that you see there as part of a European project. and it was called Everywhere. And with this one, we even had 500 people around the Heathrow airport participating in measurement. And a recent one, which also used the unique ability of people to smell, is actually called Odor Collect. And it allows people to report about nice smells or bad smells that they are experiencing in an area. So say a factory that is creating all kind of smell nuisances. And that's something that actually, with all the effort of chemistry and creating artificial noses and other things of that sort, there is nothing like figuring out the people who are suffering from the situation to report about it. And the same thing about noise. Actually, when you dig into the story of noise measurement and noise regulation, you will discover that this whole dB and dBA and all kind of other measurement are trying to imitate what annoys people. So why not ask people what annoys you and then record the type of noise? So the next type, and I assume that I've lost you now with all the types of citizen science, but that's part of the story to show you that there are lots of things happening, is DIY science. And DIY science is people doing things like, for example, DNA sequencing by themselves, or developing a biohacking lab. That's the one over there was created in Ljubljana as part of another European project, doing it together science. And people kind of analyzing the information and doing things with it. And then you also have area which we kind of didn't talk about so far, citizen social science, which really now take off in the past 2 years. So I've showed you humanities, I've showed you natural sciences, I've showed you environmental sciences, but there is also work in the social sciences. And social sciences create all kind of special complexities when people are involved in becoming the data collector and asking the questions and analyzing the information, because things that we could do as social scientists in the past, of taking information from a community, walking away, and anonymizing the qualitative information and so forth, you can't anonymize if you are a citizen science from the neighborhood. Because even if you take the name, by telling the story or the detail of the interview, you'll probably figure out who it was. So it requires special sensitivity about how you construct the whole thing. So here, to kind of finalize it, real topology that I created in order to explain what we're trying to do in my group, which is called the Extreme Citizen Science Group, and kind of also to explain what the kind of things that you've seen so far. So we can think about different levels of engagement. In this case, we are actually talking about the level of control over the project. So you can have level 1, crowdsourcing, so things like the volunteer computing, you doing it in task, and that's about it, but also a lot of aspects beyond it you don't need to do especially. You can think about level 2 when you are asked to be engaged cognitively. So a project like classifying galaxies and other tasks like that are falling under this category, but also observing birds and reporting about them. The level 3 is participatory science, when the participants are saying things about the problem definition and involving the data collection, but actually the kind of initial bit and also the analysis bit is done by the scientists who use their techniques. And finally, you can think about the extreme citizen science when we it's the extremities, that's why it's called extreme. It's the edge of what you can do with citizen science when you passed the whole process into the community. They decide what's the question, they decide the methodology, they decide the data collection, and they do things with the analysis. So the DIY science that I showed you clearly fall under this category, and there will be other examples of that sort. So kind of to summarize what I've been confusing you for the last 30 minutes, lots of variety of disciplines, examples from across the board, technological range, I show you app, I show you paper, I show you lots of other things. And leadership, Mostly, as the Oxford English Dictionary identify, it's done by the scientists, but also there are community-led projects, and importantly, in the medical area, there is N equal 1, which means one person doing experiment on themselves or collecting data about their pattern and doing the work in this area. So let's talk quickly about why, who, and where. We're now moving to the issue about why does it happen. So I showed you technology, and a lot of people kind of talk that it's the technology that made the difference, the mobile phone and other things. But as important is the change in the world in the level of higher education. At this moment, there are 240 million people studying for tertiary education, okay? And as a European goal, we are approaching something like 42 to 45% of population, and there are already countries that are ahead of that, say Luxembourg. So now let's look what we see in citizen science. So in 2015, if I look at the distribution of people in the EU in general, about, something like 27% had tertiary education. Another 46 finished high school, and 27 were in lower secondary education. So let's look at what we know about citizen science project. OpenStreetMap from 2010. And in this project, people are creating the Wikipedia of maps. So it's a collaborative map that everyone can contribute to, and creating a map, a digital map of the world that anyone can then use. And at the moment, it's actually being used to create the maps that help the humanitarian effort in Turkey and Syria. You look at the population there, and you actually have, 95% of them are with tertiary education. Not only that, 8% got a PhD. Now you think, oh, that's just one case. So let's look at project from the humanities, transcribe Bentham. In this project, people are transcribing the writing of an English philosopher called Jeremy Bentham. Bless him, wrote 100 pages a day with a handwriting that would put doctors in really fantastic handwriting, because, of course, if you write in the middle of the 19th century, it will be quite terrible. And in this one, 25% of the participants got PhD. The number of people without it, just 3. Now think about what you've seen in the average population in the UK or anywhere else, and what you see here. So you would say, okay, but Galaxy Zoo is easy. Well, we had Hani doing this work. Again, in Galaxy Zoo, 10% of participants got PhD. And people without it, it's just 35%. Unlike the 70% that in reality it is. And is it all just in the 2013? So no, a paper from 2020. You look at the number of participants and just look again, no college education, really below 10%, and that's a project in Seattle in the US, or River Watch in Illinois, and again, you look at the graph, apart from also the bias, you now can see also the ethnic bias. So one of the graphs, if I'm correct, yes, that shows you what Illinois look in general, and this is what the project look like. So those are people that monitor rivers and kind of participate in active water pollution monitoring. But let's look at the education level. Look at how many people are in graduate level and how many people are graduate in the program. So I hope that I convince you that across citizen science, the highly educated people are really playing a strong part. And this already gives us a little bit of an answer for where the quality of citizen science comes from. It's because we got 10% PhD students. Sorry, PhD, not students. People with PhD. And what we ask them to do? To classify galaxies or to digitize maps. Now, if we look at the distribution, of course, you would see distribution between that. So that's near to where I live. There are some deprived neighborhoods, so you can see the area here in red is the deprived area, and over there you can see the map of iNaturalist, which is an app of people collecting the data. And this is not the best example, but there are other more extreme examples, but you can kind of see that the areas that are red don't have a lot of observation in them. There is actually a socioeconomic bias that exists in the data. There are also other biases, like, for example, World Community Grid, which is a project about this volunteer computing. When people download the application and contribute to science, 90% male. And not just that, you have the age group, others, and of course, in this case, a lot of people are from IT. But that's not always the case. For example, in Transcribe Bentham, there is actually a nice distribution, and most of the participants in Transcribe Bentham are women. Okay? So you can have different things between different projects, and it's a bit more complex landscape. Another phenomena that is almost always appearing within citizen science project is something that is called participation inequality. And that's something that actually been identified first time in mailing list in 1992 by researchers in Xerox PARC. And what it tells you is that when you look, and those are just the generic of it is sometimes it's called the 99-1 rule. But actually, if we look at things like, for example, and let's forget about the blog because it's 2006, but Wikipedia. So you look at the number of people who open Wikipedia and look at it. Then you look at the number of people that contributed maybe once, just click, edit one word, and never done anything else. And the heavy contributors that contribute everything. And what you discover is that a ratio of 0.0003 of participants. Actually, it's something like 30,000 people in the world who are creating most of the content. So actually, you have a tiny group of people that are influencing and are shaping the experience of huge group of people, and whoever they are, and you know, I've showed you that they've got PhDs or they got masters and they are highly educated and from specific background, they will influence the system. Okay, and this thing, just to tell you, for example, you all got in your pocket Google Maps. In Google Maps, you have about 1.5 billion users. Out of them, 150 million contributed only once, but actually there are about 450,000 to 500,000 people who contribute reviews and edits and other things. And those 450,000 out of the 1.5 billion are shaping the experience of everyone else. And kind of think about, and that's kind of people who have more time and other things. And although if you'll go into the video, you see a lot of pictures, I'm a contributor to Google Local Maps, which is one of the most unknown crowdsourcing projects. People just don't even notice that it's in their pocket. And my suspicion that they look much more like me than some of the people that you see in the videos of Google. So there is a lot of bias happening. And the degree of the bias is really amazing when you look at it. So OpenStreetMap, the project that I showed you, by the time you go to the first 25,000 users out of 2 million, you actually got 80% of the data. Or another one, when you look at people who do biological recording, collecting data about it, you discover this bias happening both in the people that collect the data, but also in the people that classify the data. So to summarize the who and where, not surprisingly, overrepresentation of very highly educated people. And participation inequality really shaped the data in the way, but it's also give you quality control. Okay? It's wrong to assume that it will be the people with the PhD who are at the edge of it. People are coming from different places, but what happened at the higher end of it, you need to think about it, that the person who is at the edge with a lot of contribution have done many thousands of contributions, and therefore, even if they were with high school education, they actually develop expertise in this specific area. They have seen more images, or they classified more information, or they ringed more bird than any professional scientist. And therefore, you see in the situation, and it's really fascinating to watch it ethnographically, how the scientists sometimes defer to these volunteers because they have now some specific expertise that the scientists don't have. So that's something to kind of remember, but that gives you quality control. And there are structural disparities in society play into citizen science, but also the reason for that are many. It can be leisure time, it can be the ability to pay for equipment, or even for travel. So we've done the citizen science, and I told you more or less what's going on there, or some points about what's going on. Now let's put it aside, and I'll talk with you a little bit about environmental information, because that's something that we need for the next part. So, what you see in front of you is the history of the modern environmental movement as it appears in a lot of books. Some of you may be familiar with it. Silent Spring, appearing already, include a lot of environmental information inside it, talk about the death of birds from DDT. Stockholm Conference in 1972 was the first UN conference on the issue of the environment. In 1992, there was the main conference about the environment, the one that started the IPCC. It's called the Rio Conference, or the Earth Summit, and it created something called Agenda 21, which is kind of talking about different activities on the environment, and so on. You know, we can go on in different samples. But what you can see about this period, if you kind of analyze it, you see different concerns. So if the beginning there was activities like Clean Air Act, and it continued to be issues of local concern, like the Noise Directive or the Water Directive in the EU, you are moving into global issues like climate change, and those themes continue to play out. You have the developing and the development countries kind of arguing about what you need to do. You have to kind of think about the role of government and non-governmental organization. So if at the beginning it was just kind of government need to sort it out, as you move through the history of the environmental movement, you see more opening to participation of civil society. So actually now in IPCC meetings, in the COP meeting, you see a clear role for NGOs to actually participate and contribute. Same things in biodiversity, and there is kind of acceptance of multiple stakeholders, especially with NGOs being accepted as the speakers for the environment, because otherwise, if there wasn't the WWF talking about animals, who will represent it? It won't be any specific countries. So there is a lot of literature on that, and I'm just touching it just for our context. And you have, from dealing with specific problems, to big framework. But in all this, there is always a role for environmental information. And here's the example. This is, I'm going back to the origin and to Stockholm Declaration from 1972. And they talk there about the free flow of up-to-date scientific information. Notice that they ask for scientific information, and transfer of experience must be supported and assisted. That's how you deal with environmental problems. You start sharing information. And indeed, out of this conference, they created a system called Infoterra, which continued to run for quite a while. And you need to dig to some UN document in order to find it. It was basically a glorified Rolodex, or address book, or contact list, or whatever you want to call it, that the UN and the contact point maintain. And they had a big mainframe with all the records of, you can ask it, where can I find an expert in air quality? And they will tell you, you can contact this person. And it cost a lot of money to run each query on it, but it was about kind of pointers in order to facilitate this transfer of information. And other things that happened with it is the creation of different monitoring framework around the world. So those are monitoring station of air quality, which sprung and now kind of a requirement of every municipality to do, but also modeling. So this is, for example, out of the noise directive, you need to create these models for each city in Europe, and you need to update them every time. Now, how many of you know what LDN mean? How many of you know what the resolution mean? And so on. So that's the nature of environmental information as it appeared. This is actually quite an old one, but the new one are not much better. So what we can say about environmental information is that it makes a lot of sense. Environmental problems were scientific problems. However, what was created up to 92 is creating an obstacle for democratic participation. It's practically telling the public, go away, if you don't understand LDN, don't come and talk with me. Or go and learn what LDN is, and then come back. So it's actually creating something that is sometimes called epistocracy, which is the democracy of only the knowledgeable, or technocracy, you know, and that's what this first phase created. And indeed, there was recognition of democratic deficit in environmental decision-making, which was addressed by Principle 10 of the Rio Conference. And sorry, that was central to my PhD, so I always read it fully, because I'm with it for a long time. So environmental issues are best handled with participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. At the national level, each individual shall have appropriate access to information concerning the environment that is held by public authorities, including information on hazardous material and activities in their communities, and the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes. States should facilitate and encourage public awareness and participation by making information widely available. Effective access to judicial and administrative proceeding, include redress and remedy, shall be provided. Okay? So you see here 3 parts: access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice. Now, there is something weird, because in all kind of other democratic processes, we actually would put the line that starts from here, the opportunity to participate, as the first thing. Before you go to vote, nobody stops you and actually asks you, do you know the manifesto of all parties? You don't know? Go learn it and then come back. Notice how here, without access to information, you can't participate. We actually created a system in environmental decision-making that you have to have the access to information in order to participate. And that's why it's appearing first in this declaration. And it's not just appearing first there. It's also appearing in a convention, which is really important for all of us. It's called the Aarhus Convention. It was signed in Aarhus in 1998. And it's the Convention on Access to Information, notice, again first, participation in decision-making and access to justice in environmental matter. And that one is now covered 46 countries, including the whole of the EU and European countries, but also all the way to Central Asia. And it's kind of emphasizing these 3 pillars of environmental democracy that I mentioned to you. So you can see those 3 things are holding it. And I'll come back to them later. But then this thing continued to evolve. So 10 years after this Aarhus Convention was set, in 2008, Jackie McGlade, who was the head of the European Environment Agency, was noticing that often the best information comes from those who are closest to it. And then the European Environment Agency launched for the first time, and this is really early in terms of web mapping and crowd contribution to information, so the creation of really early web-based citizen science, ability to report about water. And later on, the European Environment Agency was launching also also a system for noise and other things like that, and adopting citizen science as a source of information. So to summarize this small visit to environmental decision-making and information, it structures around scientific method. That's what counts when you're doing environmental decision-making. Now, there is a really good reason to do that, okay? So some things like air pollution, some of them, you can't smell nitrogen dioxide or nitrogen oxide. You won't notice it. And therefore, you need sensors and you need the scientific method in order to know what you are exposed. You also talk about cumulative impact, so you need to count that. But some bits of it, as I demonstrated to you in the citizen science, smell is something that is human. Noise is actually a psychoacoustic phenomena. It's not sound. You are actually measuring with the sound meter, you are measuring sound, which is air vibration. You are not measuring noise. So the noise directive is not about noise in a weird way because of the way that we created it. So public access to environmental information is a partial solution for this democratic deficit, and it's providing a ladder while maintaining the existing condition. Now, that's a ladder in the Holy Sepulchre. I won't get into the story, you can search it, or I can ask me in the questions, and I'll tell you why this ladder is actually demonstrating a status quo. It's there, by the way, since the 16th century. And every time it falls apart, they build it again and put it back. Or, no, 19th century, I think. I might be wrong in the centuries, but it's there for a very long time. And I'm from Jerusalem, so that's why I know about it. Okay, so now that I explained those to you, I can go into citizen and community science and some examples of that so you can see. First example come from Louisiana, the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, community that lives next to petrochemical factories, and they have, what they were doing is that during the night, when there was no supervision, was releasing all kind of chemicals, and then you don't have evidence for it. And the capturing of the information was really complex. So a community initiative with some help of engineers and some of the support of Erin Brockovich, which some of you heard about, created this ability to actually have the bucket, which are a simple device. You can see that it's canisters from oil. Then they capture the air, and they can send it to the lab in order to analyze it. And if you want to read more, there is fantastic work of Gwen Ottinger about it. But that allowed the community to capture pollution incidents and dealt with them. Or the public laboratory of open science and technology. So when there was the Deepwater Horizon incident in the Gulf of Mexico, and there was no way for the community to monitor it, a group of technical people, some of them connected to the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, but also people from MIT and other places, created the ability of community to use helium balloons and just a simple digital camera to create this fantastic aerial photograph that are created by the community and allow the community to monitor by themselves, and that leads to a community that deals with this information. So another example is the work of Jennifer Gabris. You can find about the concept of citizen sensing as a community infrastructure and actually creating a civic infrastructure to support different engagement of community. And she's done it with air quality monitors that are DIY. People can build them and put them into a community and calibrate them and then use it in order to talk with the authority. Or there is a really good example of the sensor community, which is now also people who are creating their own DIY air quality monitors, and you can see it started in Germany, but it's now accepted in the Netherlands and integrated into the National Environmental Monitoring Framework. And of course, I couldn't ignore that project. But that one is really fascinating because the example that I'll show you first is a top-down one. The scientists wanted to collect information and send the sensors and all the rest of it. But actually, the original one started in Antwerp when a group of civil activists and urban planners and other people talked about it and started it bottom up. So it's a project that started bottom up with community interest and also then enroll into it the newspaper. And again, I won't try to pronounce it because I just won't do it justice. And then it kind of progressed to the 20,000 cases in Flanders. So let's finish now in the last bit about different insight. What have we learned from all the things that I talked about in the past 50 minutes? So first of all, we need to rethink about value-laden participation. We need to think about assessing the social value. We can think about about the social institutional integration. We'll think about dealing with reputation, and we'll talk about the policy. So the first one is that how many people here know about Arnstein ladder of participation? Just raise your hand. Yeah, people from urban planning, you would know about it. If you don't know, Shari Arnstein is actually a really fascinating figure because she actually been consultant in some companies that you wouldn't associate with the paper that she wrote if you look at her life. But she was kind of experiencing the redevelopment of a lot of housing in the States, and she was created the Arnstein ladder of participation. And just notice what she's talking about when people are working with communities about participation in decision making. So she's using words like manipulation, therapy, informing, consultation, placation, partnership, delegated power, and citizen control. Everything is really value laden. Okay? And what you have to know is that there is actually the Arnstein ladder factory, which a lot of people in urban planning and in related area created their own ladders of participation, usually with something at the top and then this kind of things at the bottom, of kind of saying, you should aim for the top, you shouldn't go to the bottom. And unfortunately, I've also done my bit, and you've seen it earlier, on that. And the problem is that it's wrong. It's actually, this is the situation. Some people, what citizen science tell us is that some people want to participate in climate change, but what they can do in terms of balancing care responsibility, children, work, and other things is download software and run it on their computer. And that makes them feel that they are involved. And they should be appreciated for doing that. And some people would want to participate in medical research and download software on their phone and walk around and participate in pandemic experiment. While in some other situation, they will have a problem that they want to do extreme citizen science. But we shouldn't put value on specific form, and we shouldn't assume that extreme citizen science is somehow better than crowdsourcing. So that's point one. Point two is kind of the weird things about this kind of over-participation of highly educated. Although society get huge benefit from the fact that a lot of people are highly educated, actually citizen science is kind of getting back for society the kind of societal value of investing in bringing people into very high education. When we're creating a very engaged social society, we actually find that people exist across society with this capability, and citizen science is kind of giving us a way to get some of it back, and also get us into the fact that a lot of people with PhD and with masters would not go to the research and development system. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But that's a way for them to continue and engage with their area and continue to involve in the science and actually update their knowledge. But what we can think is that the disparities actually give us a potential. So we can think about a system where these very highly educated people are spending some of their time contributing to marginalized groups and helping them, instead of this disparity that I show you on maps and other things, to find a system where we can engage it better. So that's something that we can think about the social value. The next things are about the institutional transformation. And the issue is why institutions and scientists find it so hard to accept citizen science. So what I showed you is that require a different mindset. You need to accept uncertainty. You don't know which instrument people are using. You don't know which phone they are using. You will have different results. In the example that I showed you on Heathrow, we discovered that phones, when we took them to the lab, which was ridiculous because it was a bunch of geographers taking phones to the lab while the physicists that actually designed it didn't took it to the lab. And it's kind of a reverse of things. The phones were really uncalibrated. They created all kind of numbers. They were actually random number generators. From which point, actually what we've done in Heathrow and all that, they were a complaint mechanism. So the value on the phone was medium, high, and then they can say it's actually recorded something, and then it was the qualitative information that we dealt. But that's something that all these structures are very different from the way scientists and institutions are used to do, so they need to think differently. Another thing is that there is a sort of a rule: you don't crowdsource because you want to, you outsource because you need to. So I explained to you that as we've gone through the lecture, I talked with you about the different aspects of it. For example, the fact that you need a lot of people across the country. You need to reach them at different times of the day. You need to do all sorts of things. So that requires you as a researcher and need to reach all these things. Or for Kevin Shawinski, the need to classify million images, which was impossible for him to do. Now, if you talk about businesses, you do discover examples that could be obviously be done better. One of them is the census in the US, where instead of asking people in each location to tell them when there was a change in their area, they actually hired people in their institution to do this classification. Why? Because they felt that the quality control will work for them better. But that can be solved in something called expert in the loop. So in the UK, there is a biological record center that engage with a lot of recording community. Then the scientists in the middle are collecting the data and analyzing it, and also know how to deal with environmental information that come from citizens. And therefore, you have something that a policymaker can trust and they can work with. But also, I can be a bit more provocative and say that the data quality issue is more an excuse than a reality. And the example of that is that I can, I had it with few scientists, of kind of saying, you know what, you always complain about data quality in citizen science. I'll go to your funders and tell them that from now on every research application, you need to submit a data quality plan. Because, hey, you are so concerned about data quality, surely you're going to do it about your own research. And of course, they almost punched me for suggesting to add that. But you need to ask, why are they so confident about their data quality compared to these things? And therefore, you think there is some excuse here, there is some quality issue. And one of the things that I experienced myself is when I've done work with a community in London around air quality, and we use diffusion tubes, which are the same instrument that was used here in Kreuzen-Neusen. You see, I've tried to do it, and you see now why I didn't say it. And we use the same date, we use the same lab, we use the same procedure and the same height as the local authority. And the local authority officer sent us a 4-page letter about why we can't do it as well as the local authority. There was a kind of concern that it's going to be taken over of what they are doing and they didn't want to do. So luckily, now there are recommendations of changing these things, and now we're getting into the policy. And things like, for example, the UNESCO recommendation of open science are not only recognizing citizen science as a new way of engaging with society, they're also recognizing indigenous knowledge and local knowledge as something that open science should adhere to. And now those recommendations have been accepted by UNESCO states. So we can go around to our government and tell them to change. And even in Europe, there is now something called the just finished mutual learning exercise between 11 member states, including Belgium, around this whole process of how to integrate citizen science into the research and innovation system. And all the reports are available online if you want to do. And the final point, now looping back into the whole issue of environmental information, we actually need to start thinking that those 3 rights of environmental democracy need to be augmented with a 4th right, the right to create environmental information. We as citizens want to have the right to create environmental information, and that the authorities would listen to the information that we are creating. Of course, it's a very different from the other 3, and the work of Anna Berti-Schumann that you can find in Sensing Justice is really dealing with this direction. She's a both legal scholar and doing fantastic things in citizen science. She also has some kind of comics type writing, so really worth visiting her work. So I'll finish with some resources. You have, the website eu-citizen.science, where there are a lot of material and training around citizen science. And also, cheekily, because I'm showing you that, I can say that this presentation was sponsored by the EU Citizen Science Project. There is also open access books. So if you'll go to UCL Press website, you can find this book that we issued not long ago, 2 years, and it's about geographical citizen science, which is especially relevant. And there are some urban examples, but there is also a book about citizen science that also available for free. They are open access, and they've already been used a lot. So to finish, citizen science is about different forms of democratizing science. And you should be really careful with Auenstein ladder when you look at that things. And because of the importance of environmental information, it's also crucial for democratizing environmental decision making. It's actually, you can't separate it from the 2, and you need to really think what we do with that. There is a potential for community-led citizen social science or citizen data science or citizen science to address local need, which you can think about. And the policy support is emerging, but the culture change of expert and policymakers is a complex process. So I hope that was interesting overview, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Muki, for your presentation. Is there any question, remark from the audience? Please.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I was very curious, especially for the first part about this crowd. You presented us some demographics about who is participating. So I don't know if you did that in the beginning. If so, I'm very sorry. I wanted, if you allow me, to know the people who are interested in participation. So we're not a crowd who is participating but interested. How many of us have a PhD or are doctors by hand? Okay. How many? I'm trying to see if there is a correlation also with people who are interested, and how many have a master degree. Okay. So the third one was high school education. Okay. And I see also a very young audience. I saw it earlier. I don't know if they're still here. So how many are still in high school or primary education? Super. Thank you very much. Thank you to you. Okay, perfect. It was my question for the crowd then, but based on your information. Thank you again.
Need to be switched on? No. Yeah, it's a really good thing to ask in general, but the point is that citizen science need to be open. This kind of, the fact that it's there doesn't mean that that's how it should look like. And one of the critique of citizen science, which is very appropriate, is that if you open a project and just let it run and don't pay attention to participate in your recruitment approach, you'll end up with what I showed. But that's not deterministic. That's what happened when you start a website and open it up and run it. If you want to do, and that's something that is covered in the book that I mentioned, it is possible to work with non-literate hunter-gatherers and let them design citizen science projects. And we have done that in 21 cases. And yes, it's extremely expensive and it requires anthropologists to spend 6 months in the field with them, but it is possible. And if it's possible to do it with this population, it's possible to do it with everyone. And it's, for example, you can think about the way that project can lock people out, for example, in language that use too much jargon, and the science thinks, oh, I simplified it enough so an undergraduate can understand it. And you need people with expertise in science writing to know how to write it for someone with high school education, because that's the population that we can engage and should engage, and we should think about how we do inclusive citizen science much better.
Thank you for the presentation. That was really interesting. What particularly was interesting to me was when you're talking about local authorities in the UK and their willingness to work with citizen science outside of their own framework. So I was a transport consultant back in the UK, and we worked a lot with local authorities on like public engagement and consultation, and we found a lot that certain paid services, I can't remember the names, but the ones where like local citizens could put a pin on the map and they could highlight a problem with the bus network or the street or whatever, they could do that openly and then give feedback to the council who'd then act on it. And that was generally accepted, we found, in like a local authority context, because they'd paid however many thousands to this company to do it. But I wondered, in this sort of broad theme of citizen science, is that still A, considered citizen science, though it's paid, and sort of gatekept by the local authority? And B, are more and more authorities starting to, or are they willing to draw upon the more open science that you talk about as a reliable base for their work?
Yeah, so really, really great question. I think you were also mentioning not up my street, fix my street.
That's it, yeah.
That's the application, and there is examples of that. And that's actually got really close to citizen science, because it's a factual thing that a light is broken in your street, or there is a pothole, and other things. Analysis of these things show that it's, surprise, surprise, the highly educated and the kind of socioeconomically better off who know about this website and contribute to them. But again, you can have a system where you outreach and you find a way to engage with that and this system. What is interesting in the analysis of institution is that if an institution was accepting and got used to crowdsourcing and understand how to use it properly, they will do other projects. So while I was criticizing the US Census of Bureau, in the same study that we've done to the World Bank, we found that the USGS, which was used to crowdsourcing in different things, continue to create new projects. And NASA, for example, that started to have citizen science, got a really fantastic division in citizen science. Now, if people call it citizen science or participatory mapping or consultation or other things, it really can be very different. A lot of time, the differentiation is, lots of time, if it's factual, that's one differentiation for it. There is a document called the extra characteristics of citizen science that help somewhat to navigate this kind of issues. But you can get it, and there are many areas. So the environmental areas or the public health area where the local authorities find it much more difficult to accept it, exactly because of the point that I was raising at the end. And that will require cultural transition, which is challenging. I don't underestimate how challenging it is, and we need to have kind of services within local council of people that know these things and know how to analyze data and know how to set the study right, so they can get the, they would not create inequality, and they would be able to outreach and pick up the right apps and design the data quality into the data collection process and all kind of other things that we know. The great thing about what I love about the emergence of citizen science as a kind of interdisciplinary field, which happened in the past, say, 12 to 15 years, is that all this knowledge from the different fields is kind of coming together. So there is a journal, Citizen Science Theory and Practice, that is getting a lot of methodology where you can pick it up. There is now books. There is a lot of papers in this area. So actually, it's now possible, much more possible, for people to do it right. And that's something that we can hope. We hope that people would learn. There is also the EU Citizen Science Platform is also doing training in that. So you're right, and maybe we should think about training on citizen science for local authorities in order to help them to get into this area and do it right. Because it's not simple.
No, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Hello. So something that I thought that I always think is quite interesting, Lisa, was actually your first slide that made me think of it. There was something very British about the kind of middle-class pensioners standing in front of the local post office, and that's kind of the imagination I think quite often is almost kind of. We're about to see glorious Britain. No, but just the imagination of the sort of, you know, clearly the inequalities about who is participating is the classic criticism of all of this kind of thing. And I was just interested,
This
you know,
bit, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so let me just do something so people can see it. Just a sec. I'll bring to the front so people can see that, and I'll explain what it is. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just there's an interesting tension, perhaps sometimes at least, and there's no right or wrong answer, I guess, to this, between the idea of some kind of participation and local authority or whoever the political institutional actor is, wanting to listen to more diverse perspectives, right, and giving and listening to citizen perspectives, but also, of course, often, if a project is entirely citizen-led, that it might well be advocating just one particular thing, right, so that it might be in opposition to a certain project, and that might be, you know, it can be accused of NIMBYism or something like that, so that you then have a conflict that the local institution that in the end has to decide, you know, in a way, is it going to side with the advocation of a local citizen group that's perhaps in opposition to a project versus maybe there's some bigger need for something. Do you see what I'm getting at? That there's going to be kind of a tension between those two things.
Yep.
And I was just interested whether you have any kind of experiences in that conflict, right, where a political decision has to be made that isn't as is more complex
You've
than
selected
just
the perfect
that
picture.
kind of thing. Yeah, well, you
I'll
have,
explain to you why. No, you've actually pointed. I just put it there because I thought it's nice to start with, and I like it. This is taken in Isleworth, which is sort of 2 kilometers or 3. Even as a geographer, I don't want to say something wrong on the distance, but it's really close to Heathrow. And what you see there is I told you about the app that was recording the wrong sound level. So that's the people in the community starting to collect it. And actually it's interesting because people didn't have smartphone. And we, actually to this community, we brought in smartphone with data packets so people can start participating. And we reach out to all kind of local groups. So it's actually the more poor part of the area around Heathrow with far less political power. And we were directed to them by Plain Stupid, which was an activist group, to work on the data recording. And what is interesting is that you see there are people just before they're going home to start collecting data, after we told them that this thing is recording wrongly, and we all agree that what they are recording is the nuisance of the airplane and the fact that they can't sit in the garden, and that even if Heathrow will put triple glazing on their homes, they would not be able to go out to the garden. So what's the point in the triple glazing? And that was around the third runway. Now, this is really interesting because it's indeed the case that there is so imbalance between a national project, creating a third runway in Heathrow, and the power of local community, and especially the poor part of a local community when their neighbors are really rich. So those of you who don't know, the Queen's Castle, Windsor is not very far off, and they've been participating in the project. And of course, the flight path are passing over Isleworth and not over Windsor. Okay, surprisingly. So you actually have all sort of dynamic playing out in this type of situation about who collecting and who is participating in data collection, and what you as the kind of instigator of a citizen science, what you need to do. And the community, just as us, knew that there is a futility in the whole thing. So think about it, and that's an invention of Christian Nold, the guy in the red shirt over there, who talk about both utility and futility of the activity. So we know that it won't change because the project is too big. But if you'll read the literature on environmental justice, representation and the ability to actually have your voice heard is an important part of environmental justice. And some citizen science, like this, or the noise mapping and other things, are done with that in mind. So we kind of, people are getting into it with realization of how much it can change the urban landscape and the politics of it and all the rest of it. But, and I never underestimate the political sophistication of communities. So the people that we work with, I usually follow their signals in what we do with it politically, because they will know the relationship and the connection with the authority and which levers can be pulled or not, and all the rest of it.
Okay, then I have, is there anyone? Okay. Okay. I have a question, then I'll give it to Francesco, or maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I had a kind of maybe provocative and stupid question.
There was no stupid question. No,
I was no, but because since I'm in academia as well, I was wondering for this extreme level of citizen science, which involves problem definition by the community.
Yeah.
I was just wondering to what extent this is useful in the context of, let's say, societal challenges that are not really visible. And I'm thinking here, I mean, you mentioned air pollution, climate change, global biodiversity loss. To what extent, if, let's say, we leave the problem definition to citizens in general, which for these challenges that we cannot really see unless yeah, there is some. I mean,
yeah, I know
you know what I mean. I mean, it's just that, for example, I mean, when in research, you try to always look what is the, let's say, the state of the art and look at what these are the knowledge gaps and so on. But that's not so easy. So I was just wondering.
And it's really, really good point. And I should, I didn't talk about it in the presentation, and maybe I should have talked especially in the part where I was saying that there are different ways of working with organizations. So part of the status anxiety that I mentioned towards the end, it's what's called the cult of the amateur, that citizen science will replace all science. There is no intention whatsoever that citizen science is the right thing for everything. And it shouldn't be. This is not where it plays out. Some cases, like the same way that scientists are lots of time looking at big issues, they a lot of time missing very local and applied issue in their area that can work and change life, and also bring in new ways of thinking. So, for example, I'll just give one example. We brought in researchers that was thought that is expert in mold, and kind of houses. And for his perspective, he created a toolkit that completely solved the way of mold and kind of humidity at home, because we gave regime of opening the window and all the rest of it. We brought him with community members who then told him that actually they are living in a rented accommodation. They can't move because it's social housing and it's London. And if they'll move, they'll be actually chucked out completely from London and lose their work. And that they have a baby, and that because of cost of living, they can't open the window and just let the air in when they are drying clothing. And all these kind of claims that they don't understand, or what's called in the information deficit model, you should do these things, just clash with reality and don't work. So if he was doing it in kind of developing all his approach and then approaching communities to kind of refine the approach, it might have come with a better toolkit that would really solve problems for society. And I've seen it several times through my career, more on the closer applied side, okay? And it's not saying that the IPCC shouldn't be there or the CBD shouldn't be there. But once it's opened it up to other forms of knowledge and allow them to play within this game of knowledge production, and we kind of accept that science is the least worth method that we have for producing human knowledge, but it doesn't mean that it's the only way to produce human knowledge. Or another way to see it is when kind of we're thinking how much knowledge science have and how much knowledge humanity have. And those are two different things. And we are used to dismiss it. We are used to kind of think that what, say, hunter-gatherer groups is not relevant knowledge. And actually, it's hugely relevant. And it's hugely relevant for issues like climate change. And without collaboration, we can't get hold of it. So it's kind of calling for better collaboration, not calling that it's in every case. I don't expect everyone tomorrow to become, a classic one is the DIY biology that I showed. So, for example, there was a period where in the biohacking community, they were joking that there was more security service people that had been appointed to look after the biohacking community than biohackers, okay? Because the whole CIA and other authorities were afraid that tomorrow someone will create a bioweapon in their kitchen. Now, what they forgot is that, as I know, how many people here actually experience a wet lab and doing research, keeping some bacteria alive? Yeah. So any of us will try to do that in the kitchen. Trust you, it won't happen, okay? And you need the equipment and you need the know-how, and there is so much implicit knowledge that when you check what is actually happening in biohacking space, you find that a lot of cases, and remember going back to my slide on showing that a lot of people are outside academia, it's actually people who done biochemistry or molecular biology in their PhD, now working in another area, and the biohacking space is the place where they can go back to the lab and play around with things, and they know what they're doing, and they've got code of ethics, and they've got even, like in some cases, in some spaces, you've got a really detailed ethical procedure or even health and safety procedure, because it's dangerous stuff. You can burn yourself and so on. So that's kind of thing. It's not saying, again, replacing things. It's saying a different synergy between science and society and accepting different forms of knowledge. Does that address the question?
Thank you very much.
Sorry for not including in the slide. No. I should include it.
I'll give the word to Jens for a question, but since I try to keep a balance in the questions between also like men and women participant. For the next one, I really encourage the women to step up if they have a question they want to ask.
Thanks. It's just a little note on mentioning Christian Noll. I did a project with him in some years ago in the suburbs of Copenhagen.
Oh,
and
yeah, the money.
The story is that it was part of a festival. There was too short time, too little money for him to actually define what to measure. So he took air pollution and noise. So a little bit what we already talked about. But in that community, this was not really seen as an issue for many reasons. But the point here is that we managed to get a lot of people together and talking, and actually we created this critical mass so that people started talking about other things. And the fact is that a local market was organized from that time and still is every month. So the citizen science became kind of a catalyst for something completely different.
For other things.
But it's
yes. And it's not the only case, by the way. There are now examples of that once you have, say, people monitoring the park, they're also creating resilience for their community. So if there was a flood or something like that, there are evidence now that those participation forms are creating a better and more connected and resilient community.
Thank you. So I have a question about the cyber science, and then more especially about like the software that people can download on their phones, for example. And then you mentioned the software that was used during the COVID period. A lot of people didn't really see it from a scientific point of view, but found it unethical or found it some big brother is watching stuff because it was tracking where you were and it was tracking you all the time. Yeah, with the COVID-19 app. Yeah, this one. And I was wondering how you would position yourself within this discussion.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting issue that didn't came up during the exercise. It's really interesting what happened when you do an experiment and then you try to turn it into a different context. And I have a lot of criticism for a lot of policies during the COVID where science and policy moved very quickly to top-down approach without consultation and without engagement. And although you need to kind of think about, say, a permanent citizen assembly in waiting, some sort of mechanisms where we can consult wider society on continuous basis. I have a kind of hazy concept about that, but nothing specific. But that's the case that when they've done the experiment, of course, people volunteered and people had informed consent. And they kind of knew that the data would not identify them. And while they were going home and all the rest of it, there was all kind of things that they've done. The researchers that done the experiment are doing that. I suspect that out of that, it came, we can do it also for the real situation and other things without thinking through all the ethical aspects. And maybe because also that's one of the cases where the researchers who designed the experiment originally were so focused on the modeling of a pandemic that they didn't, say, integrated a social scientist to kind of have a discussion about the ethics of it and the privacy concern. And that might have provided the information ahead for the issue when we will need it in situations. So I completely agree with you that deploying something that worked in one context and kind of thinking, that worked, so we can deploy it, is the wrong thing. And one of the fascinating things about citizen science and those approaches is that it allows for this social trying and experimenting with different approaches.
Another man, sorry. Great presentation, very sort of synthetic overview that one rarely sees. I was wondering how to deal with citizen science in contested spaces, because to some extent we rely, I think, on all the examples you give are, you could say, kind of citizen science basing on this idea that there is ultimately some kind of communicative rationality where people can communicate across disciplinary boundaries, but especially issues in the urban context around air pollution, noise levels, etc., are highly contested. both with communities being divided, having different opinions. And these opinions can sometimes be so strong, it can also be politically instrumentalized, or let's say in a more populist manner, that makes it very, very difficult to even start engaging in some kind of substantive manner with citizen science. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's actually something that, again, need to be really carefully approached. So the same way that I've said that when we're going to hunter-gatherer society, we have anthropologists learning the language and spending time there and understanding how to work with things. Same things with urban communities. So I'm very much in favor of ethnographic approach, where you first of all go and talk with people and understand the issue from the local perspective. For example, we, in our practices inside the group, we recommend to identify times when the community come together, so you can have, say, a morning tea of the elderly people in the community, and then you ask permission to come along and talk with people and start building up the understanding of the community. There were several communities where once we went in and realized that the issues that we are talking about are contested, we couldn't work. One of the most interesting example that we came across, and that wasn't that, like, it was interesting and not interesting for the PhD student who done that, and you'll understand in a second why. So she got into a place where we worked with in the past, and we thought they would be great. So it was a community center that was refurbished into a new passive house, standard, built and owned by the community, and therefore we will go there and kind of do community centering around their community garden and all kind of other things. And what we didn't know is that the community space itself became contested. So it was just around the financial crisis. The local authority, instead of helping the community, was kind of suddenly turned around and said, oh, you get along yourself with this new community center. And suddenly they had to give the space at the bottom of the community center to the architects that designed the things as a payment for their effort. So they have rent-free space, and suddenly half of the space gone. And the whole community center, instead of being operational, was much more constrained in what was possible to do. And the community just kind of figured out that if they had the old center, things would be better for them getting into the crisis. So they developed really strong emotions against the center. And there was no way we could actually carry out the work. So the students spent a year kind of with doing different experiment and an event and trying to join things until we reached the conclusion that it won't work there, and replace the case study and completely change it. In other cases, like the noise mapping that I'm showing there is this futility, knowledge that it's not going to be possible. But you're right that in this case, people are kind of mostly want to constrain the airport. In other cases where there are activities, yes, we came across that. And then, for example, in the citizen social science, it's much more common to do that. So an exercise that we do is just like the map that you see there at the bottom. It's very effective to take maps of the neighborhood and ask different households to mark 5 things that they like and 5 things that they don't like. And then you take a GIS and you integrate all these different maps. And nowadays you can put in a QR, kind of coordination, so it's all kind of registered and get into your GIS quite easily. But still, people are interacting, with the paper map and kind of doing it on their kitchen table. And then you see kind of places where people are positive and negative about things. And a lot of time there will be flashpoints of both positive and negative. And then your role as the person who initiated the project is actually do the facilitation. So and to kind of try to have a community discussion, or to realize from the members of the community that it's no hope and you need to avoid this area. And that's that's one of the cases why the reason why I'm mentioning that you need this special function on citizen science, because that can be really emotionally taxing. You need a lot of emotional labor in order to deal with this type of situation. And I don't want to expect all scientists and all kind of researchers to do that. So the recommendation now that are coming from the European Citizen Association, from the League of European Research University, from a lot of other people, is to create this function of people that know and can facilitate and can see the situation. And it can be a new function, but yes, that happened, and yes. It's complex. And even with communities when we work in the forest, if there is no agreement, we have to walk away. Yeah.
Okay, any other question?
Okay.
Okay, I have a question on the phone.
Yeah.
Okay. It's okay. So I have a question, and that has to do with uncertainty. And I think you mentioned it at some point in your presentation. And so I guess I'm just asking you to further develop a little bit on that. And so I'm asking this because part-time I work for the Environment Protection Agency here of Brussels, and I see my colleagues who measure air pollution, for instance, really having big concerns with uncertainty. And so there are two reasons why they're concerned, I think. One is this obsession typically of natural scientists, quantitative scientists, with reducing uncertainty as the goal of science more than the curiosity. But then the other one is also because as public administration, you can't afford uncertainty in front of citizens who ask you to minimize it on one hand, but also not only ask as a political pressure, but also as a legal question. If the air monitoring is done has a degree of uncertainty, that then they will take you to court and say, look, you can't ask us to give up on the car if your measures are not solid enough. And so yeah, my question has to do exactly with the relation with uncertainty and how to deal with that, and what's the some more reflection about that.
Yeah, so that's kind of, I've done a flash discussion about environmental information in environmental decision making, and it will be a completely, a very long talk about the whole issue, because remember that I mentioned that it's environmental information is kind of central to environmental decision making, but people don't notice it, that it's there and it's under theorized and accepted. And what people don't notice is that in the journey between being collected and kind of understood by scientists to getting into decision-making through laws and regulation, there is a lot of industry intervention in all kind of processes, and that change what will be collected and setting up thresholds and all kind of other ridiculous things that are happening in the journey, from empirical data that are being collected to things that actually happening in the world. So, for example, the diffusion tubes that I was showing, it's really silly device if you think about the way that it works. It's from the 70s, and still it's the standard device to calibrate. Why? Because in the 70s, when policymakers were looking for something to do that, then it was invented as a response to the public cry. So if you look at the history of where these tubes came from, and then they've been integrated into the law. And once they are in the law, that's it. Nobody wants to dispute, especially as they're going through courts and other things. And then something becomes standard, and you're stuck with it to a degree, and you have to adjust things. And other things is PM10, which is far less damaging than PM2.5, but PM10 is in the regulation, so you have to measure it now, and you continue to measure it. So that leads also to the whole issue of uncertainty and other things. The scientists are actually asked, from perspective that you can see in STS literature and other things, really a question that they can't answer. They are asked to measure things, but the uncertainty in the system is so high. So, for example, a lot of the pollutants are corrosive to the devices that measure them. So the performance of even the top instrument for measuring NO2 will continue to deteriorate over time, and you can't rely on it. You need to replace them, and they are being replaced over time. And other things like that that are happening. And so they're asked to take out uncertainty from the system, while also kind of adopting to the law. And that creates a lot of problems, and that's why there is kind of belief that you take few instruments and you really know. You know what's their performance and you know the deterioration, and then you do the modeling and you do all the work around it. What you can say about citizen science in this situation, it is this example of having 20,000 diffusion tubes, which is something that you wouldn't be able to do because of this backyard problem that I mentioned. It's actually giving you information that you wouldn't be able to get any other way in terms of resolution. And because they're all analyzed by the same lab, you can be fairly sure that they are all the same thing. And the same things can be about a lot of low-cost sensors where you can measure it. So there is what it requires is different approach in terms of the statistical analysis, because the distribution will be different. It won't be what you've designed. Sampling methodology is different, but there are methods to do that. And that's the bit where I think that it's like for the scientists in the room, that's the fascinating bit about citizen science. How do you extract signal from really noisy and messy data? And there are now fantastic examples of how to do that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Is there just wait a couple of minutes for the shy people to take courage if they have more questions? Otherwise, I'll thank you very much, Muki, for your interesting presentation and the audience for your question. I would like to invite you all for the next Stadtsalon Urbain. Is in 2 weeks, it's the 3rd of March, and Linda Westman of Sheffield University will speak about climate policy and the urban age. Feel free to stay here a bit longer to interact. And voila.